Hello everyone, I'm Claire and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'm going to be sharing how to paint a kingfisher in acrylic. I'm a wildlife artist and I've been drawing and painting for many years now, and in this video I want to share a glimpse into my process. If you would like to follow along to the full tutorial class along with many more fun and beautiful projects, feel free to subscribe to my Patreon channel where I upload new content every month. So for this kingfisher painting I used golden heavy body acrylics and a small selection of brushes. The reference photo, thanks to Morffew, line drawing and full materials list can be found on Patreon too. So I firstly started with the background using a mixture of blue and yellow. These are the cadmium yellow and cobalt blue. I simply experimented with the ratios to get the right amount of green, and I went with the cobalt blue rather than the ultramarine just for an extra bit of vibrancy. So once dry I then sketched out my initial line drawing with a white charcoal pencil and then got to work on painting the actual bird. So the actual process of the kingfisher goes through a few ugly stages, and the first ugly stage is blocking in the main base colours to cover up the background colour, and then we have a foundation layer to build upon. I started with blocking in the blue feathers, then followed by blocking in the orange tones. I mixed my orange using some red and yellow and a little burnt sienna, and I discuss and share all of my colour mixing in its entirety in the full tutorial class on Patreon. Next I carefully outline the shape of the eye with a little black, using a small brush to help with the accuracy of the size and the shape. I added a little blue for the glimmer in the eye, and then I proceeded to block in the lights and the darks on the beak. I also used a small mop brush to soften the transition between the colours, just so I can have a softer blend rather than a harsh linear look. Next I moved into blocking in the white feathers. Just a note at this stage, I'm not concerned with perfect colour accuracy or detailing. It's all about blocking in a base layer with very rough colours and placements of those colours. So here I'm just blocking in a few purple grey tones and that iconic light blue strip along the back. And then I moved into mixing some very basic blue tones, some grey shades of blue and others more of a true blue and light turquoise. Next I started on the fun part of adding details and marking out the feather direction. I used just a tiny dash of water to help the paint flow more smoothly, and not only was I working with a small brush, but I also made sure to apply a very light pressure so that my lines stayed fine and delicate, which avoids any thick clumpy brush strokes. I plan to add glazes to these paint strokes in a little while, so again colour accuracy isn't important, I simply used white paint. I took my time to ensure those tiny details followed the correct direction, which makes life easier at a later stage as we build up the layers. Some feathers were longer than others, so I also paid close attention to matching the length of my brush strokes accordingly. Next I started the process of adding glazes, and this is where I started to look at mixing the right blue tones. The process of glazing involves adding a slightly translucent layer of paint over the top of lighter paint strokes so that the underlying feathers can still be seen, but we are simply tinting the white with colour. So then I worked on refining the shadows, adding a darker blue to bring those deep shadow details in. And a little colour to add to the white feathers. And I did the same glazing process with the orange feathers as well. And because we had a nice bright white underlying feather structure, the orange glaze shows up as a really nice bright orange. Here I'm just doing a little refining, adding a few details along the beak as well as making sure that those glossy wet highlights on the beak are nice and bright. Onto the next layer of building up the feather structure, this time being more refined and deliberate with my paint strokes, adding tiny lines for details, which I will then tint with a glaze shortly. Adding some glazes now and really taking notes on the tones of blue. Some are more truer blue and others are a little more turquoise or grey tone. Same with the orange, working on richening up the shadows of the orange feathers with some burnt red type tones, but also making sure that they contrast against the really bright orange of the lighter feathers. Moving on to the body, and I started with mapping out the feather direction with fine lines to establish the structure of the feathers as well as the length and the curvature. I'm not using too much paint on my brush as I wanted to maintain a fine quality to my brush strokes, as well as ensure that my paint was translucent enough not to eliminate the underlying base colour. I'm being careful here to make sure that the adjoining areas blend nicely together, slightly overlapping each other with those subtle curves. Here I'm starting to add in some glazes of blue to bring out those deeper shadows, and I'm using a tiny amount of phthalo blue to tint a subtle turquoise tone to the feathers. It is a highly pigmented colour, so we don't need too much, and then I'm softening off the paint strokes with a small mop brush. I'm looking for broad areas to apply a glaze, as well as those small areas which only require the point of the brush to add a few tiny shadows in the details. And I'm adding some long brush strokes here to add some really subtle shadows that lie softly in the light blue feathers. And then, just like I did with the head, I'm going back over to add another layer of feather details. Again, just using a translucent paint and a really fine touch to bring out the fineness of those feathers. Just adding a few more shadows now to give the wings a little bit more of a curved appearance. Now I'm starting to block in each shape of the wing feathers with a light blue paint. This has quite a bit of titanium white mixed in, so we have a bright base to then glaze with blue afterwards. Now I'm adding a slightly brighter blue glaze to tint those shapes. Starting to add a few shadows to the grey feathers now, and also adding a few details to define the shapes. Now I'm starting to work on mapping out the feather direction on the chest, again using only white so that we can glaze a bright orange on top afterwards. And I'm taking my time to make sure the feathers curve gently, and also using a light pressure with my brush to help with the fineness of those strokes. Just adding a few tiny highlights. Then going back in with the dark blue to reaffirm those shadows and to make the colour a little richer. Now working on adding a bright orange glaze to those white feathers that I painted earlier, and this is really making that orange chest pop. And then going in with some dark orange and a little red to pull out those shadows and add more depth to the orange feathers. And here I am going in with a little bit of brown to the deepest and darkest of the orange shadows, just to pull out a little bit more depth and warmth to those shadows. So I've just reapplied my initial sketch so I can pinpoint those prominent white speckles that are really iconic of the Kingfisher. I'm going in with a blob of titanium white to begin with, just to mark out their placement. Then I'm starting to pull out the dark blue tones within those shapes, a mixture of both glazing and more delicate defined lines. Here you can see I'm starting to add a little bit of a bright blue to glaze over those white speckles, and that is just tinting them with a little bit of colour. And now I'm starting to do some refining and tidying up, adding a few more details and making sure everything's nice and neat. I'm spending a little bit of time with some titanium white now, some quite opaque and bright brush strokes and others more watered down and fluid, just so that I can add a few highlights. Some of them I want the highlights to be nice and bright, so just underneath the beak, and others I want to be a little bit more subdued and in the depths of the shadows, such as down the orange chest. Adding a little bit more of an orange glaze now to help that orange to pop. I'm starting to cast my eye over the entire bird now, looking at where I can make those shadows a little deeper and going in with a little bit more darker blue to reaffirm those shadows and help them pop. I'm finishing off with the tail feathers, starting with a light blue base and then glazing over with a brighter blue. And then working in some more vibrant blues and some darker blues, working while the paint is nice and wet to help blend those colours together. And then adding a few more fine highlights down the strip on the back to make it look as though the light is hitting that part of the bird. Here I'm adding a little bit more shadowing to the tail feathers to make that light strip pop and appear a little brighter. I'm moving on to the branch now, and I'm starting by blocking in the darks and the lights and then softening the transition between the two with a mop brush. I'm now starting to dab the branch using an old brush of stiff bristles and just gently pushing down on the branch with a light pressure, starting with the darks for the shadows, a black and brown paint, and then moving on to white paint for the highlighted part of the branch. I'm now going in with my round brush, just adding small dabs of the brush to create even more texture to the branch. I'm also using the point of the brush to emulate moss. It's just some small tiny lines, and I'm not concerned at all about the colour that I'm using because we will be adding glazes soon. Here I'm just mixing a yellowish shade of green to glaze over some of those mossy areas. There are a few greens I want to incorporate into the branch. This is a yellowish shade, and then I'm now going in with a darker shade of green. I'm using a mixture of both my old brush for some of those dabbled textures and also my round brush to glaze over some of those lighter white strokes that I painted earlier on, just tinting the green slightly. I'm also making sure to apply some dark green as well to build up the shadows of the moss. And then where I want some highlights, just going in with a little bit more white paint to then glaze over with a brighter green. And not forgetting some of those tiny details of the moss that splay upwards into the background. Moving on to the foot now, which is a really bright shade of orange, so I really wanted that to stand out and pop. So I started with a base layer of titanium white and then glazed over with a shade of orange. I then added a few darker shades of orange for the shadows and the creases in the feet, and then a little bit of white for the highlights. Not forgetting to add those final details from the belly feathers that overlap the branch and the feet. Again, starting with titanium white and then glazing with a little orange. And then it's just on to the final tidying up process of adding a few details, a few highlights, and casting my eye over the entire bird to see where I can make some adjustments. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this little insight into my process of painting this Kingfisher. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to paint along to the full tutorial all in real time with nothing missed out, including all the colour mixing that I go through, then feel free to join me on Patreon, where you can access this painting along with many more. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you on the next video.